G'day and welcome to our weekly gospel reflection given to you from various members of God Squad around the world. My name's Dave Fuller and I'm speaking from the deep south of our world, the city of Melbourne. I'm the chapter president of Melbourne and also the international vice president. And our reflection today will be based on Matthew chapter 16, a small portion of that chapter, and I'll get to that in a moment. Let's continue to be mindful, friends, of our brothers and sisters in Ukraine at this particular time, keeping them in our prayers and our thoughts. And many thanks to those of you who've been able to get practical support to the families there. Our families are separated. Families separated from one another, women and the children in other countries, the men, many of them fighting and are in great danger at this particular time. So let's be mindful of them. The other thing to say is that here in Melbourne we're working hard on the 50th anniversary celebrations this year, and we're working hard on the national run, which will be held here in late October. And we're grateful already that there's about 35 international members signed up who are coming to Melbourne, and we're certainly encouraging as many of you as possible to be able to make it. Well, down here we've just passed the winter equinox, and slowly but surely the days will start getting longer, and over a few months a little bit warmer. We've just had a major survey in our country, the National Church Life Survey, which is a major study of religion and religious attitudes in our country. And recently the question was posed, who is Jesus Christ? And some 57% of those who responded did indeed believe that Jesus was a historical figure. There was 23% of Australians who saw Jesus as a mythological figure who didn't really exist, and then there was about 22% who were uncertain on that particular question. We've also just had our census data released, and for the first time in the history of our nation, certainly since the colonisation, that we now have less than 50% of Australians identifying with the Christian faith. We're down to 44%, and I think it's about 39% of Australians who identified in the census last year as non-religious. So it's a reminder that we've got a significant task to do, particularly in many Western nations, which really do need to be re-evangelised now, and that is certainly one of the functions and tasks of God Squad Christian Motorcycle Club. Well, the passage today is a well-known passage, and it relates to the whole question of the identity of Jesus. Matthew's account has a really strong sort of focus on Jesus as teacher, and we know that the Gospels are sort of theological biographies of his life. But in this particular passage, Jesus draws his disciples aside for a bit of an in-house teaching session, and he poses the question to them, and it's one that many of us would be familiar with. Who do men say that I am? And the disciples respond not their own convictions, but what other people tend to say. Some say John the Baptist. Some say he was Elijah. Some say Jeremiah, or some of the other prophets. Jesus takes us for a while and then pushes back a bit on them and says, but who do you say that I am? Well, no one offers a view except Peter. Peter, the one who is quick to speak, one who is quick to offer an opinion. And when he responds, he says these words, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus responds to Peter and affirms his answer and basically says these words, "Peter, you have understood that because my Father has enabled you to have that particular understanding." His declaration is crystal clear. Jesus Christ, the Anointed One, who has come among them, is indeed the promised Messiah, according to what had been prophesied over the centuries through the Hebrew Scriptures. And not only that, he is the Son of the living God, noting Jesus' special relationship with God. And then Jesus begins to focus on Peter. And he replies in this manner, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome." Jesus first addresses him as Simon, which was his birth name, his Jewish birth name from his parents. But he goes on to speak further in terms of who Peter is going to be, and Peter's destiny, and Peter's purposes in God's great design and plans. Jesus names him Peter and uses the metaphor of a rock to declare that Peter will be a leading figure in the church that God will birth. And we know that to be the case, do we not? Peter will be the dynamic preacher on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit falls on the disciples there in the upper room. It's Peter who takes them from the privacy of the upper room out into the streets, where he preaches one of the most powerful sermons in the book of Acts. And we see a huge response to his preaching on that particular occasion. It's later that Peter will be the one who will take the gospel to the Gentiles. It's Peter who is led by God to meet up with Cornelius and his household there in Caesarea. It's Peter who preaches to the Gentiles and sees the Spirit come upon the Gentiles in the same manner that he came upon the believers there in the upper room in Pentecost. It's Peter who goes to the Jerusalem leadership and shares with them that the gospel is now breaking out among the Gentiles. It's Peter actually at the Jerusalem Council who begins to persuade them who wanted, and many of them wanted, the Gentile believers to be circumcised. And it's Peter who leads the charge and who witnesses to the power of God among the Gentiles. And then ultimately James, quoting from the book of Amos as his authoritative source, believes that God's light was always going to go to the Gentiles. It goes on to say this about Peter: "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Not only will Peter have a leading role in God's purposes for the church, but he will carry great authority, the keys of the kingdom. The term binding and loosing refers in the Jewish context to the exercise of authority. And I have just given you many examples of Peter exercising authority and leadership in the early church. But I'll conclude with this about Peter and his role. Peter is a good news story of the Gospels, chosen by Christ, but apt to running at the mouth. And we know that he failed badly towards the end, as just before Christ is crucified, when the heat really came on, Peter was found wanting and denied Christ on 3 occasions and was totally shattered as a consequence of his own failings. But then after his resurrection, we see Jesus gently restoring Peter to leadership again, there by the Sea of Galilee. Peter had given up. He'd gone back to his old trade, fishing. But God had more for Peter than just being a fisherman. He was to continue to be a leader in the church. And we see Jesus gently restoring Peter by the Sea of Galilee. "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, I do, Lord," he said. "Feed my sheep." "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, I do, Lord. Care for my lambs." And we see Jesus recommissioning Peter to be a leader and to exercise authority in the church. Peter will spend the next 30 years exercising that leadership and authority in the ancient world as he carries out his apostolic ministry, as he declares to both Jew and Gentile that Jesus is indeed the promised Messiah of Israel, the Holy Son of God. Peter would die in the same manner as his Lord died, executed by the Roman state. But his legacy lives on in the Scriptures, and today the Scriptures tell us something of his appointment by Jesus Christ. May God bless you as you reflect on his word. Amen.